Welcome to Convention of States, a project of citizens for self-governance. This evening we are going to talk about term limits for Congress and Supreme Court justices. Term limits is the second most popular suggested amendment according to Convention of States surveys, the first being a balanced budget. You all probably know the arguments for and against, but tonight we will set the stage and go a bit beyond. Advocates for term limits want to amend the Constitution to add them. Their most common argument is that restricting how long an elected official may serve will curb special interests, influence, and other federal abuse. The Articles of Confederation, the document governing the United States between 1781 and 1789, restricted members of Congress to 3 one-year terms. This was called rotation in office. But when drafting the Constitution, the framers consciously decided not to include term limits. Were the framers correct to omit them? Or are modern advocates correct to seek them? Well, the answer is the framers were right for their times, and modern advocates are right for our times. One way of thinking about whether a constitutional change is relevant is to ask, if the framers had known about it, might they have written the Constitution differently? In fact, there have been several developments that may well have induced the framers to include term limits. First, the federal government is far larger and does many more things than anyone imagined when the Constitution was written. The founding generation was very skeptical about giving anyone so much power, especially over an extended period of time. Next, relatively few members of Congress retire voluntarily after a few years, as the framers thought they would, and as they frequently did for many years after the Constitution was written. The growth of federal influence has discouraged retirement by augmenting the charms and perks of office. And finally, the framers believed that a member of Congress who lost contact with his or her district would be vulnerable to challenges from back home. But today, large congressional staffs and modern transportation and communication methods enable members of Congress to maintain well-oiled local machines to promote their own reelection. As a result of such factors, the average tenure of members of Congress has increased enormously, as documented by a recent Congressional Research Service study. For Congress, 200 years ago, members served on average about 2 to 3 years. 100 years ago, they served 4 to 6 years. The corresponding figure today is more than 10 years. As for the Supreme Court, the justices of the court, who are appointed for life terms, are deciding far more social issues than anyone expected in 1787. Their average tenure was about 8 to 9 years in the decade after the Constitution was adopted, but it now exceeds 21 years. Federal abuse may be one reason for term limits, but it is not the only reason. If no abuses had crept into the system, term limits might well be a necessary response to the dramatic political and social change that has occurred. Well, let's look at some of the benefits to congressional term limits. According to a 2015 Gallup poll, 75% of the public supported congressional term limits. So, what effect might term limits have? Well, first of all, proponents argue that a limited tenure for members of Congress could motivate them to seize the day and exercise their power on behalf of their constituents and the common good. Second, a lack of long-serving members could reduce power advantages gained through seniority and lead to committee appointments actually based on merit. Number three, cycling leaders out and in of office could remind them of what real life is like and make them more effective leaders. And number four, above all, supporters argue term limits could reduce corruption and increase independence from special interest and partisanship. By rotating leadership, lobbyists and advocacy groups would not be able to invest in campaigns and curry favor over time. And finally, power tends to corrupt. So if power is limited, the thinking goes, so is corruption. Well, what are some of the benefits to Supreme Court term limits? Again, in 2015, a Reuters poll found that 66% of the public supported Supreme Court term limits. So what effect might term limits have? Well, first, when judicial tenure is shorter, the president can nominate and the Senate can approve more replacements. Citizens would take comfort from the fact that a majority of the court would be replaced in a few years. Second, judicial independence is important, but we can increase turnover and preserve independence through a single long term without the possibility of reappointment. And number three, term limits would end the presidential game of appointing young and relatively inexperienced justices in the hope that they will continue to influence the court decades after the appointing president is gone. If a nominee could serve only a single long term, a president might feel freer to nominate a more experienced person, say in his or her 60s, rather than in his or her 40s or 50s. Now let's look at a few points in opposition to term limits. On the congressional side, with such a large and complicated federal bureaucracy, members are most effective and most resistant to special interest when they are most knowledgeable. In other words, tenure equals greater knowledge. Next, defenders also claim the idea is undemocratic. Why shouldn't a constituency be able to reward or punish its representatives as it sees fit at the ballot box? On the judicial side, older justices have had time to hone their judicial temperament and skills. With longer terms, justices can develop their judicial philosophy and find common ground with their colleagues. It can take decades to formulate and advance a position on a social issue that ultimately persuades colleagues to join. And finally, many judges mature and write their strongest opinions after long service on the court. Life tenure affords the conscious time to ripen, without fear of reprisal for unpopular views. Well, now we come to that familiar point of, well, what do we do? Well, of course, our first step is to hold an Article 5 Convention of States for the purpose of amending the Constitution and propose amendments for term limits, such as no person may serve more than 12 years as a member of Congress, whether such service is exclusively in the House or the Senate or combined in both houses. This is a suggestion from Mark Levin in his book Liberty Amendments. Another Mark Levin suggestion is no person may serve as Chief Justice or Associate Justice of the Supreme Court for more than a combined total of 12 years. And finally, a suggested amendment that came out of our Convention of States Article 5 simulation: no person shall be elected to more than 6 full terms in the House of Representatives. No person shall be elected to more than 2 full terms in the Senate. In other words, this is the 12-year rule. So again, these are just suggestions. As a matter of fact, in my research, I came across another suggestion with regard to Supreme Court justices that the terms be limited to 18 years. So I'm sure that there are other suggestions out there, and once again, these are only suggestions. While term limits do not apply here, I believe the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 needs to be revisited to enhance the process for needed terminations within the over 2.7 million federal workforce. I believe many anti-constitutional federal employees exist under the protection of this act. The administrative process involved, which is meant to prevent politically motivated firings, gives employees the right to appeal the termination, a process that can take up to 2 years. According to a USA Today study, it was said that, quote, federal employees' job security is so great that workers in many agencies are more likely to die of natural causes than get laid off or fired, end quote. For example, how many employees do you know have been fired for Benghazi, IRS, or over the VA? Well, the answer is few to none. Some were even allowed to retire, and some in the State Department just got reassigned. Government employees, in my opinion, need to be more on par with private sector employees. Term limits should apply to more than Supreme Court justices. In addition to the Supreme Court, Congress has established 13 courts of appeals and 94 U.S. district courts. All of these judges are referred to as Article 3 judges because they exercise the judicial power vested in the judicial branch of the federal government by Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. There are currently 874 authorized Article 3 judgeships, 9 on the Supreme Court, 179 on the Courts of Appeals, 9 on the Court of International Trade, which I have not reflected here, and 677 on the district courts. All federal judges are appointed to life terms by the President and should be subject to term limits, the same as the Supreme Court. So what does this all mean? Well, I came across a good quote that I think sums it all up. It's a quote by a Linda Grinnell. I believe the founders formed the best republic possible, and that they were wise in creating checks and balances that would ostensibly keep one branch of government from becoming too powerful, or even abusive. Unfortunately, today, after more than 200 years of jockeying for control, all three branches of government have learned ways to increase their powers and influence, and have far surpassed the powers that the framers of the Constitution granted them. Well, in closing, my favorite quote from Rita Dunaway, our national legislative strategist for Convention of States, is as follows. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you.